This is the Art of Darkness podcast with Kevin Kautzman.
And Brad Kelly. We're a couple of very online writers interested in the dark side of what drives creative people to create against all odds.
This show is about art and the people who make it, what it costs them, and what it takes to bring something unique and impactful into the world.
Each episode, we excavate the life and work of an artist you might think you know.
Don't worry, they're all safely dead.
On every episode, we try and find out just what the hell was wrong with them and how they worked through their darkness to create something that lives on after them and continues to move culture.
Find us online at artofdarkpod.com and on Twitter at artofdarkpod.
Okay, a couple more things about this Tiny McLean, and then we'll kind of we'll keep moving on here. There happens to be, just coincidentally, another woman that she already sort of knew, an acquaintance of hers that ends up in McLean. And this is the woman, Jane Anderson. She's the character Joan in The Bell Jar. Eventually, Jane Anderson would actually sue the Plath estate. She'd actually, basically, which was run by Ted Hughes, for libel based on her depiction as Joan in both the Bell Jar book, but more specifically the film adaptation, where it was it was shown, the character of Jane Anderson was shown to be sort of involved in a lesbian romance. Interestingly enough, we have another case of this doubling thing. Both of these girls went to Smith. Both at one time had dated the same boy, and both had grown up in the same Unitarian church. And they end up at McLean at the same time, and yeah.
Oh, we're dealing with these are Unitarians.
Yeah, I was waiting to tell you that, Kevin.
It's all coming together.
Yeah. In The Bell Jar, according to Jane's psychiatrist and others, Sylvia Plath's Esther Greenwood character. And this goes back to the thing I was saying about like her mom and the sort of way she treats people. Other people who had treated her. Other people that kind of had intimate knowledge of Sylvia Plath's sort of mental health issues would say that not only in her life, but in The Bell Jar, that she has a tendency to project her own illness onto other people. And in The Bell Jar book, what she seems to kind of do, and we'll talk about The Bell Jar book a little bit more, maybe a little later, what she seems to do is the character Esther Greenwood, who stands in for Sylvia, projects her own illness onto this Jane character, and then Jane kills herself. And there's this weird kind of thing in which it's sort of symbolic death. It's almost like a way of getting rid of it, right? You put it on somebody else and then they die and your double dies, right? But the fact of the matter, and one sort of reason she put it on Jane, I think Jane was very interested in the more psychoanalytic route, right? The more Freudian route of trying to get to her illness. And Sylvia thought all that was kind of nonsense, and she was much more about the psychiatric route. This is like, the body's sort of like a machine that you can kind of like scientifically, you can, solve this problem. It's worth noting that though they both had suicide attempts and they both were from very similar circumstances, Jane, who went the psychoanalytic route, got out of McLean, went on to have a reasonably successful career as a therapist, and never really had deep psychological issues afterwards. Sylvia Plath only lived to be 30, and we know her fate, right? So there's kind of this interesting. She would sort of mock her friend for going this other route, but that maybe there was a little bit more in the psychoanalytic route that could have helped Sylvia. Who knows? Sylvia is discharged from McLean in January of 1954. She goes on to graduate from Smith. At the time, she thinks everyone at Smith hates her and is sort of resentful and mocking her. But, the documentary evidence suggests that everyone is actually quite warm and welcoming to her. There's Kevin, I don't know, did you watch 30 Rock when it was on much?
Sure, yeah. I watched 30 Rock like anybody else.
Yeah.
It was fun to watch that show evolve. I don't know how well it would hold up now. It's not Seinfeld, but it was definitely of a time. And of course, now it would feel like a period piece because it's from the before times somehow.
Right, right.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And as I said, I was trying to think if you remembered. There's a really well done scene where Liz Lemon, who's played by Tina Fey, is like remembering her college days, and she's talking about how like everybody hated her and bullied her. But when you go into the flashbacks,
She's the bully.
she's the bully, right? She's
Hmm.
being like a total bitch to everybody, and she's like preempting what she expects people to treat. Sometimes I get the feeling with Sylvia that it's like that. She's like she thinks
Okay.
everybody hates her, so she's sometimes, not all the time, but she sort of preempts it. And it's like, well, if the person hasn't been mean to you and you're mean to them, like, sorry, that doesn't you. So I only said
So
that.
much of what occurs in human affairs is projection.
Mhm,
It's
absolutely.
because we're all struggling to kind of crack out of our own
Yeah.
egoic.
Yeah.
It takes a lot of maturity to develop
Mhm.
like a first theory of mind. I mean, which a lot of people never sort of acquire.
Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
and then our society somehow strangely seems to reward this kind of hyper narcissistic focus. And
Hmm.
yeah, so in any case, it's a
Yeah.
constant negotiation. And yeah, one little thing, and if you realize, like, wait a minute, a lot of people are projecting, a lot of
Yeah.
people, it's a good. It
Yeah.
rarely steers you wrong as a
Yeah.
tool in your kit to
Yeah. Yeah.
understand people.
Yeah. No, it's good too sometimes to also just like knowing that if somebody's really bothering you, like annoying you, whatever, sometimes it's a good question to be like, okay, is that bothering me because there's something about them that I kind of think I do,
Sure, this
you
guy,
know?
he's just so handsome.
Right.
Really gets to me. He's
Right.
handsome. He's
Yeah.
articulate
Yeah. Yeah.
and
Yeah.
popular.
Right. Right. Right.
Really bug. I don't know, man. Something about
Yeah.
that guy really bugs me. Uh,
Uh,
mm,
couldn't be me.
no, it couldn't
Uh,
be. No, I'm not talking about you, Brad. Come on,
yeah.
Brad, please. We were just talking about narcissism, and you got to
Right.
make it about
You
you.
gotta
You
make
got to
it
make it
about
about
you.
you.
Are you making this narcissism conversation about you? That's
Oh
hilarious.
boy.
Well,
Yeah,
okay.
well, we don't want
Yeah.
to be too harsh on Sylvia, but you have to
No.
remember too that she's young.
Yeah,
She's young
yeah,
and
no.
she's brilliant, and
1953, she's 20 years old. Yeah.
she's a baby. I mean,
No.
she's so yeah, and
Mhm.
she's already swallowing pills and hiding from her family and trying to
Yeah.
end her life. It's pretty
Yeah.
hardcore. Yeah,
Yeah.
not good.
Yeah. Yeah. One other aspect I want to talk about in this sort of institutionalization as a kind of a theme that we're talking about right now is the using it as poetic material. When and how this tenure at McLean sort of influenced her writing. Early on, she would try to kind of hide it, right? Which makes sense. You had this big suicide attempt. It was a national scene. I mean, that's pretty embarrassing. And then you're in this mental institution. It's not a good look. You're trying to be a career woman. And, think about again the time, like you're trying to have a career in what is effectively a male dominated world. Um, and then, oh, it turns out that you were institutionalized for 4 months because of neuroticism. Like it doesn't help this process of trying to like dominate that world, right? So she kind of try to keep it on the low. But um the thing is, it becomes it when she comes upon the material, the writing of Robert Lowell, her thinking about this as a sort of poetic or creative material starts to change. And Robert Lowell, we'll talk about him just for a second. For people who don't know him, Robert Lowell, born in 1917 into a Boston Brahmin family. He's the kind of guy who could trace his family line all the way back to the Mayflower. He's generally considered to be one of the most esteemed American poets of his generation. Now, Robert Lowell spent time in mental institutions as well. If you want to hear a little bit more about that, we do talk about it in our Flannery O'Connor episode because they were friends. Um, but he would use this material in his landmark collection called Life Studies. This major poetic work, comes out in 1959, and it's most important sort of culturally, historically, for part four, and specifically for a handful of poems in part four, called one of them called Waking in Blue, which are considered to be early high exemplars of the school of poetry called confessionalism, capital C, confessionalism. Um, this is poetry that you can think of as poetry about the big I, capital I. It's a kind of neighborhood of postmodernism that deals with personal experiences of extreme moments in a person's life and touches up against what were taboos, sex, abuse, mental illness, violence, these sorts of things. And this movement, confessionalism, has a major influence on Plath. She's considered a sort of participant in it, though I kind of take some issue with that. I feel like there are a handful of her poems that are confessional, and otherwise, I won't assign her to that school. But nonetheless, um, I think so part of the reason uh, she relates to Robert Lowell is obviously he's writing about depression. She's been institutionalized, and so it starts to be she starts to realize that she actually maybe needs to use this in a more deliberate way, right? And that's not necessarily that something that she needs to hide from. And then when she discovers that J.D. Salinger, whose Catcher in the Rye was a huge influence, had also been in a mental institute, she realizes like this is something she has to leverage. And part of the reason she writes The Bell Jar is because she realizes there's sort of cynically that there is commercial appeal in writing a story that involves a mental institution, right? So she starts to realize that her life story could be commercially viable in the early 60s.
Can't make it with poetry, write a novel, just like our friend Roberto Bolaño, friend of
Right,
the pod.
right, right,
This
right,
poetry ain't paying. I'm gonna write about a novel about dead women in. No, I'm gonna write a novel about all my poet friends.
right, right,
Yeah,
right, right,
yeah,
right.
that's gonna be a smash hit.
Yeah, yeah. Now, okay, let me read this little bit. This is from when an Anne Sexton interview appeared in the Paris Review, I think, or maybe the New Yorker. Um, People who don't know, Anne Sexton was a poet at the same time as Sylvia Plath. She was also a confessionalist poet, and again, she's another one of these doubles that Sylvia Plath encountered in her life. A very powerful poet, but like all of the doubles she finds in her life, there's a sort of a yin yang quality where they don't have exactly the same things. They have something in they there's something that they have in a greater quantity than Sylvia that makes her sort of envious, but there's also a way in which she can see herself being superior to them, right? That's how they fit together. Anne Sexton was not particularly schooled. Sylvia had a much higher level of education than Anne Sexton did. So Sylvia was superior, quote unquote, to her in that way. But Anne was generally thought to be sort of raw and more direct contact with her emotional reality. So anyway, you kind of see my point. But they knew each other personally. This interviewer asks Anne Sexton this question, quote, in Sylvia Plath's last book, written just before her suicide, she was submerged by the theme of death, as you are in your book, Live or Die. Did you ever get around to talking about death or your suicides at the Ritz with Sylvia? Sexton answers, often, very often. Sylvia and I would talk at length about our first suicide in detail and in depth between the free potato chips. Suicide is, after all, the opposite of the poem. Sylvia and I often talked about opposites. We talked death with burned up intensity, both of us drawn to it like moths to an electric light bulb, sucking on it. She told the story of her first suicide in sweet and loving detail, and her description in The Bell Jar is just the same story. It's a wonder we didn't depress George Starbuck. This is a guy who's like basically leading a seminar they were in with our egocentricity. Instead, I think we three were stimulated by it, even George, as if death made each of us a little more real at the moment. Okay. Now, I'm going to read from a poem, a 1962 poem called Lady Lazarus. Um, and this is, I think, a good example of the confessional mode for Sylvia. Uh, yeah. I don't know if I'll read. I might read most of this one. No, don't freeze. Okay. Lady Lazarus, quote, 1962. This is 9 years after her first suicide attempt. Quote, I have done it again. 1 year and every 10, I manage it. A sort of walking miracle. My skin bright as a Nazi lampshade. My right foot a paperweight. My face a featureless fine Jew linen. Peel off the napkin, oh my enemy. Do I terrify? The nose, the eye pits, the full set of teeth, the sour breath will vanish in a day. Soon, soon the flesh the grave cave ate will be at home on me, and I a smiling woman. I am only 30, and like the cat, I have 9 times to die. This is number 3. What a trash to annihilate each decade. What a million filaments the peanut crunching crowd shoves into sea. Then them unwrap me hand and foot. The big strip tease. Gentlemen, ladies, these are my hands, my knees. I may be skin and bone. Nevertheless, I am the same identical woman. The first time it happened, I was 10. It was an accident. The second time, I meant to lash it out and not come back at all. I rocked shut as a seashell. They had to call and pick the worms off me like sticky pearls. Dying is an art, like everything else. I do it exceptionally well. I do it so it feels like hell. I do it so it feels real. I guess you could say I've a call. It's easy enough to do it in a cell. It's easy enough to do it and stay put. It's the theatrical comeback in broad day to the same place, the same face, the same brute, amused shout. A miracle that knocks me out. There is a charge for the eyeing of my scars. There's a charge for the hearing of my heart. It really goes. And there's a charge, a very large charge, for a word or a touch or a bit of blood or a piece of my hair or my clothes. So, hair doctor, so, hair enemy, I am your opus. I am your valuable, the pure gold baby that melts to a shriek. I turn and burn. Do not think I underestimate your great concern. Ash, ash, you poke and stir, flesh, bone, there's nothing there. A cake of soap, a wedding ring, a gold filling. Air doctor, air Lucifer, beware, beware. Out of the ash I rise with my red hair, and I eat men like air. Uh, okay.
It's
I'm
like
gonna
an
read.
incantation. It's like a prayer or a
Yeah.
rant.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
an
No, it's definitely got a.
incantatory prayer rant.
I think that, yeah, I think that's totally
Mm,
fair.
mm.
Totally good analysis of sort of the style of it. Yeah. I'm going to read just a little bit of this poem to kind of transition us into the next sort of theme that we're dealing with. And this poem is called The Colossus, and this would appear in the only volume of poetry she had published in her life. She had lots of stuff published in magazines in her life, but this was in the book The Colossus and Other Poems. Quote, I shall never get you put together entirely. Pieced, glued, and properly jointed, mule bray, pig grunt, and bawdy cackles proceed from your great lips. It's worse than a barnyard. Perhaps you consider yourself an oracle, mouthpiece of the dead, or of some god or other. 30 years now I have labored to dredge the silt from your throat. I am none the wiser. Okay. Now, a little bit later, no, I'm not going to read it just sort of for the sake of time. And this is a great poem. It's long. It's sort of about the Colossus, right? It's sort of about her father, who was, every child is their father is the Colossus when they're a child. And if your father dies when you're 8, he sort of never stops being the Colossus, right? You never grow up with him at the same time. He's always sort of the image you had of him when you were a kid in a way. And then her husband, Ted Hughes, was also like a large kind of imposing figure. And so it's about him too. Um, and here's where I want to kind of talk about Sylvia's father. And we're going to get some more kind of family history in this section. And, see, again, this episode, I'm kind of going all over the place, but I think Sylvia would have appreciated it. Um, Her father, as I mentioned, was this guy named Otto Plath. He was born in 1885 and left Europe in 1900. He was 15 years old. He eventually became a noted entomologist with an expertise in bumblebees, but he came from farmers. His grandfather was illiterate. He had eight children, all of whom immigrated to the Americas in the late 19th century, mostly to the Midwest. Um, I want to talk about Otto's mother for a minute. She was also from Posen and came over in 1901 with a number of her children already in the U.S. They settled in North Dakota. Um, Actually, Kevin, can you vamp for a minute?
I can absolutely vamp.
Yeah, let's do it. I'll be
Who,
right.
okay. Yeah. So we're talking about North Dakota. All right. So what do we have coming up on Art of Darkness? We got to talk about the book club, which is for Patreon and Substack. Patreon and Substack have total parity. Whether you sign up for Patreon Whether you sign up for Substack, you get the exact same thing. We did that because we kind of know maybe some people don't like, I don't want to use Patreon, or maybe they're already on Substack. We're also a pretty literary pod. I mean, you could probably tell. So a lot of people are on Substack already. The website for Art of Darkness is artofdarkpod.com. I'm going to read what we've got coming up for book club. Now, the way book club works is if you become a member and you subscribe to one of these things, you get access to all of the After Dark episodes, the bonus core episodes that we do just for subscribers. Brad did a paywalled episode on the Marquis de Sade, like a full episode, Marquis de Sade. You get that. That was a lot of fun. Been getting some fun feedback about that. And the way the book club works is you kind of choose your level of involvement. If you want to read along and then sign into the Zoom and hang out and be on the recording, you can. And we have some regulars. We've got some people who like to show up every time. You can sort of pick your poison. You go, okay, I want to be in this one. I don't want to be in that one. The other way to handle it is just to treat it as bonus content, right? The book club picks are always relevant to what we're doing, more or less, one way or another. So it's extra Art of Darkness in your ears. So we've already done this year Wise Blood and Hamlet, and then in July we're going to be doing Stella Maris and The Passenger from Cormac McCarthy, the late, great, rest in peace, Cormac McCarthy. And we're going to be doing a core episode about Cormac, and we're going to be reading both those books and talking about those. So that's going to be a real event. Then in August, we're going to do Billy Budd, Melville. We're going to do The Left Hand of Darkness from Le Guin in October. And then partly to indulge me because I want a chance to reread it. But we've also done a Frank Herbert episode already. Anyway, we're going to do Dune in December. And that's the book club. And, the book club is just one of the things you get if you choose to support the podcast. And hopefully you can appreciate what Brad and I do. You can tell, I think I don't even know how many hours we're into the Plath episode. If you're getting something out of this, it's $5 to get into the door. Just set it, forget it, support independent media. We are not attached to any institution. We're not selling you razors yet anyway. I don't know, razors or ED pills. We really want to just go direct to consumer, to our listeners. The other fun thing you can do with Art of Darkness is join the Telegram, t.me/artofdarkpod. If you want to impress everybody in there and let them know that you really know what's going on with Art of Darkness, share a link to your favorite pen or a comment about your favorite pen. The other thing you can do is you can join the Telegram, t.me/artofdarkpod, and you can say the Toe Ghost sent me. Yes. We have a little bit of new merch. We have a little bonfire store. The link is on the website, artofdarkpod.com. It's going to be up there in the top. And we made a shirt celebrating our mascot, the Toe Ghost. There's a shirt, there's a hoodie, and I happen to know a couple of people have bought this. Yeah. I have no idea what their friends and family are going to think. It just says, and it's easy. It's bonfire.com/store/artofdarkpod. And it just says, boo, Toe Ghost. And
it's got a ghost.
And it's got the ghost on it. Yeah, what episode did the Toe Ghost? The Toe Ghost came from the hat. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the Robert E. Howard. Yeah, and it comes out of just the idea that medical science wasn't particularly advanced, say 100 years ago, and doctors throughout time have been coming up with sometimes cockamamie solutions.
Right, we just gotta we gotta cut the toe off,
right?
Because it's and then we throw it away. Then we throw it into the river.
Yeah.
In the moonlight. And that will get rid of the Toe Ghost.
Will get rid of the Toe Ghost. Yeah.
Then the Toe Ghost returns. The Toe Ghost is inviolable. The Toe Ghost is eternal. The Toe Ghost is our new mascot. And then we also made a shirt to say "I'm with Pulp and Slick." And if you've been listening to the pod, you know that I am Pulp and Brad is Slick. And so these are ways to support the pod. They have the link on the back. We've got logo clothing. If you're an Art of Darkness ultra, you want to support the pod, it's a way to sort of promote it so that it's a conversation starter. What is this Art of Darkness? Who are these pulpits? What is the Toe Ghost?
Yeah.
So these are These will get you laid. We have gone into fashion, basically, is what I'm saying.
Yeah.
We've gone into
If you
fashion.
will it, it is no dream. Yeah.
Walter, everything is not Vietnam. Brad, everything is not Vietnam. Sylvia, everything
Yeah,
doesn't need to. Yeah.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, yeah.
All right. You
So
took a little break. I'm going to take a
yeah,
little break, but keep
okay,
going. I
yeah,
can hear you
yeah.
the entire time. And
Okay,
yeah,
good.
and just by the way, we love our listeners. Thank you for all the support. We love hearing from people. You can reach us. We're on Twitter, Art of Dark Pod,
Mm,
and Brad mans that.
mm,
And you can also hit us up on by email, artofdarkpod@gmail.com. It's great to hear from people. It always kind of makes our day. And we love taking suggestions. We love hearing ideas for possible future episodes. Hey, have you
mm,
thought about covering this person? We
mm.
can't always get to everybody in a timely way, but
Yeah,
it's cool to know that people are out there listening to this show, even when we're a little dark, we're a little quiet. You know,
yeah.
we take our time between episodes and we try to deliver you quality. So how was that for vamping? Okay, I'm
That
done
was
vamping. Yeah.
fantastic. That
Okay.
was
Okay. There you
fantastic.
go. All right.
Now,
Yeah.
yes, now I back in the Sylvia story, I was telling the sort of story of her it would be Sylvia's grandmother, Otto Plath's mother. She was also from Posen, and she came to the United States in 1901 with a number of her children already in the U.S. They settled in North Dakota. I don't know if I got to this part before I stepped out. They settled in North Dakota at first, where this woman caring for six children, Otto being the oldest, she basically lost her mind. In 1905, she began not sleeping, complaining of headaches, was depressed and fearful. The doctor said she, quote, appears to be hallucinated, and she would be involuntarily committed in 1917 to the very same mental hospital in Oregon where they would eventually film One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. She died of tuberculosis in that institution less than 2 years later. So Sylvia's grandmother, unbeknownst to her, unbeknownst to Sylvia during her life, Sylvia's grandmother died in a mental institution in Portland or in Oregon. Now back to Otto. He, being the oldest son, he'd moved to the U.S. at 15 by himself. He quickly mastered English in Manhattan, worked in a distant uncle's shop, and then he was out to Wisconsin to stay with the grandparents and study at Northwestern Prep School and then Northwestern College. He graduated with honors from Northwestern College, then studied at a Lutheran cemetery before bailing out.
Seminary. You're getting into the hours. You studied at a Lutheran cemetery. You could do that
Yeah,
too.
yeah,
Hey,
yeah.
listen, these are good German Americans, my friend.
Mhm,
If
they
you're at
are.
the
Yeah,
salt of the earth out
yeah,
here, oh
yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah,
Now
getting it
he,
in.
yeah, now he was his grandparents wanted him to become a minister, but when he decided to bail out, they scratched his name out of the family Bible. It's like you're going to be that or nothing to us, apparently. Um,
Oof.
yeah, so basically, by the time he met Sylvia's mother, Otto had zero family connections. He had been cut out of the family effectively, and he now. Here's an example, and I'm kind of looking at the clock now, and I have a lot of notes, so I'm kind of cutting some things slightly, but we're not going to miss the important, juicy stuff. Now, he's a German immigrant in what the early 19, very early 20th century. And as kind of World War One starts ramping up, being a German immigrant who still speaks in the accent, right, is not necessarily the most comfortable demographic to be in this country, right?
You're talking about my
Yeah.
grandparents'
Right,
generation.
right.
Yeah, yeah.
And so there were some issues. He probably got passed over for promotions and things like that in his academic career, at least early on. But here's an example of we're not going to read it because it's long. Sylvia Plath's most famous poem is called Daddy, and it's about her dad, obviously. And she says some things about him that personally, from the biographical material I read, don't feel particularly fair. Uh, Otto was outspoken against the Nazis, and she sort of relates him to a Nazi in this poem. It's this thing where Sylvia, she can't, and I don't even want to extend this to Ted Hughes because Ted Hughes did some really unsavory things, but she seems to have this thing where like she can't forgive people and she can't let anything go, and she just kind of like If somebody has did anything to transgress against her, it snowballs. And what he did was die. That's what he did to violate her emotional reality. And that was unfair. And it was unfair. It feels unfair, at least. And so people can go out there and read that poem, Daddy. Just don't go thinking that Otto Plath was like some diehard Nazi. It doesn't really seem like that was the case. Um, uh, Now, eventually, Otto did crank out this doctoral thesis at Harvard, published as a monograph entitled Bumblebees and Their Ways. And it became quite influential in its field. He was appointed full professor at Boston University, and that's where he'd meet Sylvia's mother. And he'd worked there until he died. Now, basically, how did he die? He kind of worked himself to death, sort of. He was a diabetic, but he didn't know it. And he had these weird paranoias about health. And he had a friend who had lung cancer, and he was convinced that he not only had lung cancer, but they had a terminal case. And he wouldn't get treatment. He wouldn't see a doctor. He wouldn't talk to a doctor. And eventually he has some major episode. He's having these like fatigue episodes. He has some major episode, and then the doctor basically determines that he has diabetes. They have to cut his foot off. And it's like so far advanced that like he's done all this damage to his body by not treating it for years, and he dies. Um, so, you know, Sylvia's 8, her brother's 5, and he's gone. Let me read you a stanza from one of my favorite Sylvia Plath poems called Electra on Azalea Path. Um, Quote, the day you died, I went into the dirt, into the lightless hibernaculum where bees striped black and gold sleep out the blizzard like hieratic stones, and the ground is hard. It was good for 20 years, that wintering, as if you never existed, as if I came godfathered into the world from my mother's belly. Her wide bed wore the stain of divinity. I had nothing to do with guilt or anything when I wormed back under my mother's heart. Small as a doll in my dress of innocence, I lay dreaming your epic image by image. Nobody died or withered on that stage. Everything took place in a durable whiteness. The day I woke on Churchyard Hill. I found your name, I found your bones, and all enlisted in a cramped necropolis, your speckled stones skewed by an iron fence. So, yeah. So as people know, I don't think I'm talking out of school or saying anything too rough edged here to say that there is a thing with women, young women, that we can just generally call daddy issues. I think that's fair. I don't think that anybody's going to take
Young
umbrage with
men
that.
too. Young men,
too.
you have people have daddy issues.
People
You
have
got
daddy
mommy
issues.
issues, you got
Yeah.
daddy
Yeah,
issues.
yeah.
Yeah.
And so Sylvia has daddy issues, and they manifest in the way that they sometimes do. And as she goes into her late teen, into college years, um, she becomes very promiscuous. And I want to kind of frame this sort of delicately, because she's not sleeping with a ton of men. What she's doing is dating a lot of men, sort of like necking in their car with a lot of men, right? So it's the dynamic is a little different than it is today. But she would date lots and lots and lots and lots of men, often sort of simultaneously. There's like a point when she's at Smith, she goes on 20,
Based.
yeah, she goes on 20 dates in 2 weeks.
Okay. All right.
It's
Yeah,
like,
okay.
how do you even?
you're crazy. You're in crazy land there. You're
And that's what it
neurotic.
seems like
Yeah,
she's. And
yeah.
again, this thing we said she has to win. She has to like do the. It felt like she had to date the most people, or like maybe not date the most, but like the dating dynamic. It's a game. It's a system, and you can win it. And she had to win it, just like she had to win everything else, right? Um, and as you can imagine, she broke a not small number of hearts doing
Yeah,
doing
that's a
this.
pretty wild little roller coaster you're on there,
Yeah.
or a little carousel.
Right, right,
Mhm.
right. Um, she, yeah. Uh, the most significant one, there's a bunch of these. And again, for the sake of time, she had, yeah, she dated a bunch of men, but the most significant one early on was this guy named Dick Norton. And Dick was a uh I think he went to the same he'd gone to the same Unitarian church as Sylvia, but they were like family friends. Sylvia's mother was friends with Dick's mother, and it was sort of like queued up to like be the perfect relationship. And he was like, by all accounts, like a very handsome, tall, well-built guy who was going to go to Yale Medical School, right? Like he was a catch. And what what the problem was, and Sylvia's friends even were like, he's interested in you, like he's out of your league. Like he was like the all-American boy, gonna be rich one day, and when you're 20, it's all about what are you potentially gonna be, right? When you're thinking about marriage prospects for a man. Um, and I think Sylvie was attracted to it, but he represented this tension she had between the career woman that she wanted, the career she wanted to have, and this family thing, because he was very domestic. He was very, uh, some friend made fun of him. He was very apple pie, like very much like traditional. And we'd get married, and once we get married, we start cranking out some kids, and you're gonna stay home, and I'm gonna go be the doctor, and blah, et cetera, et cetera. Very trad, right? Nothing particularly wrong with that, but for Sylvia, that's not going to work, right? Um, and so, despite her attraction to him, she kind of resists it, and but there's all these all family influences, right? It's her mother's friend's son too, so there's that kind of tension. There's this like this, and there's this power couple quality to it. She's this all-star intellectual scholar at Smith, and he's going to Yale Medical School. That's a dynamo, those two together. And so there's all this kind of pressure to keep it together. But in the bell jar, she ends up lambasting this poor guy. In the bell jar, Dick Norton's name is changed to Buddy Willard. And just read this bit from Red Comet. Quote, when Betty quotes his mother, the character based on Mildred Norton, saying, quote, what a man is an arrow into the future, and what a woman is the place the arrow shoots from. Esther, who is Sylvia's character, counters, I want to change in excitement and to shoot off in all directions myself, like the colored arrows from a 4th of July rocket. And we have to remember, too, that from that poem I read earlier, Ariel, that phrase, I am the arrow, right? She doesn't want to be, again, she wants family and children, but she doesn't want to be drawn into just this conventional, I'm just going to be like your mom, live my life like your mom lived hers. Like, I'm not going to do that. Right. And so that relationship eventually falls apart. But again, we see her doing this thing in the bell jar. You can see this very, very obviously. So there's a thing. She breaks up with him in the bell jar because she says he's a hypocrite. And how is he a hypocrite? Well, fundamentally, he's a hypocrite because he has had sex with somebody before, and he had sort of framed it like Sylvia was sort of the promiscuous one. He would sort of play innocent, but he had already slept with somebody, and she couldn't handle this hypocrisy. It's again a thing where she kind of makes, I think, a sort of enlarges the significance of something to sort of strike back at somebody. But that's what's going on for her. But there is some merit to it, because one of the things she felt was unfair about being a woman in 1953 was the sexual double standard. It was okay for a guy to go out and sleep around a little bit, but a woman shouldn't be doing that.
Right. And then that math doesn't add up, because it's like, see, the guy's sleeping with somebody.
Right.
The guy's
exactly.
sleeping with somebody.
Yeah. Yeah. So how, yeah. And yeah. So how does that work?
And I just,
right.
Yeah. Right.
And then if you think about it too, yeah, like, right. They got to be sleeping with somebody. But then, like, if there is this stigma, and you really don't think women should be sleeping with anybody before marriage or whatever, aren't you kind of a dick for doing it? Like, even if you think it's okay for men to, you're like,
then yeah, right. It doesn't square.
It totally does.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So anyway.
And I understand on some level they're trying to protect women, because you're sort of, I don't know where we're at with birth control at this point, but I mean,
yeah, it's not not available yet.
Yeah, you're talking about like ruining somebody's life. You get knocked up when you're 17. It's like,
yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
and
yeah,
and she was paranoid about this. This is why she didn't sleep with anybody. She didn't sleep with anybody until like she was going on all these dates, but she wasn't having actual sex with them until sometime in her early 20s before she, crossed that line or whatever.
Hmm.
Because of that very fact, she was like, I can't get pregnant. If I get pregnant, how am I going to become the poet of my generation if I'm 20 and I have a baby? Like it just won't happen. That was her
Right.
mindset anyway.
Sure,
Yeah.
sure.
Okay. So there's a bunch of other guys. Oh, one that I will point out, just because it's interesting. Um, uh, there's a guy she dated for a while named Mel Woody, and fine, nothing really to say about him. But after he dated Sylvia, the next woman he dated was Yoko Ono.
Okay, cool. Again, it's been a while since we've said this, but there are only 25,000 to
Yeah,
50,000 people alive
yeah,
on planet Earth at any given time. They're lying about the numbers. There were
right,
never 500,000 people in asylums in
right,
America. At
right, right.
most, there were maybe 2,000
Yeah, yeah,
because there
yeah,
aren't that many people alive
yeah,
at a given
yeah.
time. Like they're lying to us to demoralize us, to make us feel like we're
Mm,
not special snowflakes.
right, right,
But that's
right.
crazy that he would. So Yoko Ono is okay. So she's hanging around
Yeah,
Boston, like Massachusetts.
She went to Sarah
Oh,
Lawrence.
Sarah Lawrence. Okay, okay,
Yeah, yeah.
yeah.
But yeah. So anyway, I just thought that was
God
interesting.
love her.
I'm reading along and it's like, wait,
Sure,
is that Yoko Ono? Like
right,
in my
right.
in my head, but Yoko Ono, she's born in the 30s. So yeah,
Yeah,
she's an
makes
old
sense.
woman.
I
Yeah.
mean, she's
She's from that era.
and she's in the same dating pool as Sylvia Plath. That
Yeah.
that that is a surprising little turn that I
Right.
wasn't expecting.
Yeah, yeah, it's interesting. There is one point, kind of dramatic point I want to make, and just kind of hang on to it. So, it seems like the person that she learned her lost her virginity to, and I got to be honest, I feel a little weird, sort of like I don't have any moral opinions about how Sylvia Plath's dating life carried out. I'm not trying to scrutinize it on this at all, but I think it is significant because how her relationship with Ted Hughes plays out. The man that she lost her virginity to was this kind of quirked up math dude. And she kind of did it slightly out of spite. He kind of was like the guy that happened to be there after her Dick Norton relationship fell apart. But Sylvia ended up in the hospital. Something happened. It's not really clear. She was bleeding a lot and it like wouldn't stop. And she had to go to the hospital. And that apparently was that was her losing her virginity. Um,
Ooh, yee.
and there's like mixed stories about what actually happened, and so nobody really knows
It
for
wasn't
sure.
like violence or anything. Was
Well,
there
this
maybe?
is the
Yeah.
thing, and there's anecdotal evidence that Sylvia had a penchant for rough sex,
Um,
and
from
it's
from 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 jump.
yeah, right, right, and
Okay.
so
All
and
right.
so there's some indication that
Okay.
could
You
have had
have
something to do with that.
yeah, I'm leaning in.
Right, right. And
You have
there's
my,
some
yeah.
there's some early lovers that she might have like kind of rejected because they wouldn't go there is
Oh,
some of the suggestion. So but again, a lot of that kind of stuff
okay.
that bedroom stuff's kind of anecdotal always. So I don't want to
Sure.
like give details
Sure.
really, but
Right.
but we
Okay.
will see when it comes up when she meets Ted Hughes, it comes up.
Okay. Fun.
Yeah.
Fun.
And this is where we're going to talk about Ted Hughes. So Ted Hughes, we talked about her time at Cambridge a little bit, but what we didn't really get into detail was her meeting Ted Hughes. Now, uh, there is a poem dedicated to him that she used in what was kind of a lost novel she wrote called Falcon Yard. And this is a poem called Conversation Among the Ruins. I'm just going to read this because it's sort of about Ted. One thing I didn't say, Sylvia Plath wrote a lot of short stories, and we're not really spending any time on them. Not because I don't think they're worth looking at. It's more for the sake of just trying to efficiently navigate everybody through this story. Most of her short stories were autofiction, like The Bell Jar. They were like her life, change some names around, and then it's like a what if it went this way at the end. That's what like three-quarters of her short stories are. So they're well written. She has great turns of phrase. She never, in terms of prose fiction, she was never going to go out on a limb and write something very unusual happening or anything. Most of them fairly conventional. Most of them were written for the ladies' magazine market, to be honest, and that's what those people wanted. Just a clear story. A boy meets a girl, and there's issues, and they either get together at the end or they don't, kind of thing. That's what a fair number of them were. Not all, but some. But anyway, this poem is about Ted. Conversation among the ruins. Through portico of my elegant house you stalk with your wild furies, disturbing garlands of fruit and the fabulous lules and peacocks, rending the net of all decorum which holds the whirlwind back. Now rich order of walls is fallen, rooks croak above the appalling ruin, in bleak light of your stormy eye magic takes flight, like a daunted witch quitting castle when real days break. Fractured pillars frame prospects of rock, while you stand heroic in coat and tie. I sit composed in Grecian tunic and Psyche knot. Rooted to your black look, the play turned tragic, which such blight wrought on our bankrupt state. What ceremony of words can patch the havoc? I like that line at the end there. So who is Ted Hughes? By the time he reaches his full flower and his full career, potential, he would be ranked by many, in fact, alongside the greatest English writers of the 20th century. He would be the poet laureate of the United Kingdom in 1984. He would be awarded Guggenheim. He would become a staple of BBC cultural programming. He would write award-winning children's books, and multiple highly regarded works of poetry, including his debut, The Hawk in the Rain, Lupercal, and The Crow. He was a Yorkshire guy from humble beginnings, so very much lower class. He's born in 1930. His family barely survived the Great Depression. He was a tall, strikingly handsome man with very deep tastes and an intense kind of brooding charisma. People are always talking about him as being like a lunk and always as him being brooding. He's one of these guys who's also like considered, he's definitely like dark, tall, and handsome, tall, dark, and handsome, right? And sort of man of mystery, my next line was he had a very powerful aura, was how kind of people saw him. He very much believed.
Okay. Yeah,
it's
bring
getting me kind of roused up just talking about
oh, geez. Okay. Whoa. Well, this answers the question. Well, who were the guys sleeping with? Sleeping with the Yorkshiremen.
Right.
The ladies, we're keeping the ladies pure.
Yeah, right. Yeah. He was a guy who very much believed in mysteries and the afterlife and the white goddess, as described by Robert Graves, if people are familiar with that. Like Ted Hughes was like halfway in the cult of the white goddess, as described by Robert Hughes, basically like the muse as a spiritual entity that your creative work interact with. He had a very contrarian nature, Ted Hughes did, against, particularly against the sort of gentility and temerity of the English literary establishment. Find this bit I want to read here. Give me a moment. So let's see. He One thing I was going to read about this sort of Bolthoff group that he was part of. He was part of it's sort of like a micro counterculture at Cambridge. He had graduated from Cambridge. In fact, there's an anecdote about him drinking pint with Harold Bloom, among others, because Harold Bloom went to Cambridge. And he, at the bar, Ted Hughes got a literary reference that Harold Bloom didn't know. And that was like a violation of the laws of physics or something, right? At the time. After he graduated from Cambridge for a time, he worked as a security guard at a steel factory. He washed dishes at the London Zoo.
That's crazy. You come out with a Cambridge degree and you have this. Yeah. I mean, I guess it happens. I mean, it's part of life.
He was part of it was he was like punk rock. He didn't want to go.
Right.
He didn't want to go work and like, you got a degree from Cambridge in English. What are you going to go do? You're going to go I guess you could go
To
teach.
teach it like a boys' school. But I mean,
Right.
their class system over there too. I wonder what his accent was like, and I wonder
Yeah,
what
he had
it.
a Yorkshire accent for
Sure,
sure.
sure,
Yeah,
yeah, yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah.
So
Mm.
that wasn't good. So when Sylvia met him, he and some other dudes, some other poets that were Cambridge students or hangers on, they were basically camping in the rectory of St. Botolph's or the St. Botolph rectory. Like they were like hippies just kind of hanging out in tents. He literally lived in a tent on sort of the grounds. That's when she met him. Um, and they were part of this literary set called the Boltoffians. And the Boltoffians put out a little journal that tried to sort of aesthetically subvert the other Cambridge lit mags, which were Checker, Granta, and Delta. Now, let's read this little passage from Red Comet. The Boltoffians' contempt for the movement, and the movement in a capital M is the quintessentially English style of poetry that was in fad at the time. Guys like Philip Larkin, Kingsley Amis, Tom Gunn, and others. The Boltoffians' contempt for this movement was a manifestation of their obsession with Robert Graves' The White Goddess. White Goddess. Hughes said he soaked the book up during his 3 years at Cambridge and recalled his slight resentment to find Graves taking possession of what I considered to be my secret patch. The White Goddess became a talismanic text for Ted, Daniel, and Luke, who carried the book in their hands as if it were their version of Holy Scriptures. Let's see. Graves believed that the source of the poet's inspiration was a seductive but ultimately dangerous muse, the White Goddess, and that poetry was, quote, magically potent in the ancient sense. Now, um, oh, let me read a little bit more. Authentic poets were acolytes to this cruel muse, and the more one gave in service to the White Goddess, the larger the literary return. Poems were, in effect, offerings, though true devotion required complete sacrifice. She will gladly give him her love, but only at one price, his life. She will exact her payment punctually and bloodily. So this is like Ted Hughes, how he feels about poetry. Now, Sylvia wasn't writing at the time. She's still kind of working in this new criticism style. She was not writing the kind of stuff that the Boltoffians were. She'd come around to some of it at least, though she'd managed to maintain her own voice. But she read Ted's poems before she met him. She read his poems in the first, I think, and only issue of the St. Botolph's Review. And then she thought they were really something. And when there was a party, a Boltoffian party, Sylvia made sure that she was there. And I've got a bit to read about Sylvia meeting Ted Hughes. Okay, this is like a for literary history of the 20th century nerds, this is like a historical moment. Okay. Quote, Sylvia asked Luke, a friend who is also a Boltoffian, to point out Ted Hughes, and suddenly there he was, looking straight into her eyes. She began quoting his poem Falgrief's Girlfriends, and they shouted as if in a high wind above the music. In an unpublished draft of his poem St. Botolph's, Hughes wrote that he and Plath retreated to the quieter stove room where crates of alcohol were hoarded from the rabble. Ted reassured her that Daniel would never have written so harshly about her poem if she had not been beautiful. And this was about a poem that Sylvia had published and had been reviewed. Sylvia already suspected that her gender had made her an early, easy target, and she told Ted that a woman practically had to sleep with the editor to get a poem published at Cambridge. Ted, amused, said she was all there, wasn't she? They spoke of his dull job in London, and he told her he had obligations in the next room, his girlfriend, Shirley. But then he kissed her and grabbed her earrings and red hairband. When he tried to kiss her again, this time in the neck, she bit his cheek. Hughes later wrote this. Behind the door, I poured more brandy. We drank. I kissed you. Whether you were drunk or concentrated for a masterpiece, suddenly you fastened to me, your limbs steely like a trap. Our kiss developed till my left cheek was in your teeth and your screwed up ball face of joy bit and held with all your strength. I broke free. I was laughing, and you were laughing. Luke, Daniel, and Bert did not see the kiss or the bite, which suggests that it happened in a more private space. Jean, who had come to the party with Shirley, saw it but remembered the scene differently. Quote, I saw Sylvia coming in. She'd been in a different room. It was in full swing, and Ted was standing very centrally in the room. Shirley was standing in the doorway. Sylvia went straight up to him and bit him on the cheek. I literally saw it happen. Shirley was right behind. Ted had his back to her. She didn't see what had happened, but I could see her framed in the doorway. Jean had lent Shirley some earrings, and she had lost one. When Shirley returned to the room to retrieve it, Jean said she knew something had happened. It was just one of those electric moments. Now here's Sylvia describing it. Quote, then the worst happened. That big, dark, hunky boy, the only one there huge enough for me, who had been hunching around over women and whose name I had asked the minute I had come into the room, but no one told me, came over and was looking hard into my eyes, and it was Ted Hughes. I started yelling again about his poems and quoting, quote, most dear unscratchable diamond. And he yelled back, colossal, in a voice that should have come from a pole. You like? And asking me if I wanted brandy, and me yelling yes. And I was stamping and he was stamping on the floor. And then he kissed me, bang, smash in the mouth, and ripped my hairband off and my favorite silver earrings. Ha, I shall keep, he barked. And when he kissed my neck, I bit him long and hard on the cheek. And when we came out of the room, blood was running down his face. His poem, I did it, I. Such violence, and I can see how women lie down for artists. The one man in the room who was as big as his poems, huge with hulk and dynamic chunks of words. His poems are strong and blasting like a high wind and steel girders. And I screamed to myself, thinking, oh, to give myself crashing, fighting to you. The one man since I've lived who could blast Richard. Richard, some other boyfriend. So this is the first time they meet. First time they meet, they sort of like kind of violently make out. She
Yeah,
bites
and
his
she
cheek.
bites his cheek. I mean, it sounds like more than a like a little love
Right.
nip. It sounds like a
Drew blood.
chomp,
Yeah.
chomping. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Let me read a little bit of this poem, Pursuit.
This is
Uh,
the word that gets thrown around, but she's feisty,
she is feisty. This is like
feisty,
legit feisty. Yeah.
legitimately feisty.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not, oh, your uncle's talking about your, oh, she's a feist. No, she's
Right.
feisty.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. She will bite you. She will bite your face. And like not because you did something, just like
All
she
right,
feels like it.
because it
Yeah.
kind of gets her going.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
gets the
Now,
people going.
there's a poem she wrote about this. I think it's about this first night. It was either the first night they met. I think it's the first night they met, called Pursuit. Quote, there is a panther stalks me down. One day I'll have my death of him. His greed has set the woods aflame. He prowls more lordly than the sun, most soft, most suavely glides that step, advancing always at my back. From gaunt hemlock, rooks croak havoc. The hunt is on, and sprung the trap. Flayed by thorns, I trek the rocks, haggard through the hot white noon along red networks of his veins. What fires run, what craving wakes. Insatiate, he ransacks the land, condemned by our ancestral fault, crying, blood, let blood be spilt. Meat must glut his mouth's raw wound, keen the rending teeth, and sweet the singeing of fury of his fur. His kisses parch, each pause a briar. Doom consummates that appetite. In the wake of this fierce cat, kindled like torches for his joy, charged and ravened women lie, become his starving body's bait. So this is like early days of meeting Ted Hughes, and there's this like charged up animalistic, bloody sexuality going on, right?
Oh man, I got to return some videotapes. Do you remember? You
um,
remember being young? You remember being young and stupid
yeah,
instead of
yeah.
just old and stupid?
Oh, right, right, right. Yeah, I'm more just old and stupid now.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah, yeah.
you could still kind
I,
of LARP
you
at
could
this,
still
but
screw up
it's just
bad. Oh,
not. Oh
bad.
yeah, you could still fuck up your life. It takes one bad day, dude. I mean,
Right.
one bad morning, you
Yeah.
can screw it
Yeah.
up. Yeah, oh, yeah,
Yeah.
real fast.
Yeah. So, yeah. So, one thing I want to kind of talk about here. So, they meet and it's off to the races after that. I mean, they're married 3 months later, right? They're like intoxicatedly in love with each and sexually attracted with each other, right? To each other, right?
When
Um,
you have to put this against the backdrop too of their class, and then
mhm.
also like they both, I don't know how comparable you would say, but I mean, if he's from Yorkshire and in Cambridge, and she's from Boston, and then put this against the fairy tale kind of backdrop of Cambridge and how
Right.
heady that is, and how competitive, and
Yeah.
how serious seeming it is, and it's
Hmm.
serious. I mean, it's one of about 20 schools in the world where maybe third, maybe you got 50 schools in the world where, and that's like right at the tippy
Yeah.
top, and all the history and the buildings and the booze and the
Hmm.
people. Anyway, yeah,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
can about imagine. Hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, so they met in February. They were married in June of 1956. She's what, 24. Her mother happened to be in visiting in town, and just at dinner they said, "Yeah, we're getting married tomorrow." They got married at St. George's on Bloomsday of all days, and I think that was deliberate. And they had to keep it secret at first because Sylvia was worried that she'd lose her Fulbright scholarship if she was married, right? There was a lot of attitude at the time where like, and this was even true for women who had jobs, when if they got married, they would get sort of passed over for unmarried because it was like, well, you're married now, your husband should take care of you. You don't need this job or this scholarship or this grant or whatever. And Sylvia was worried that that would happen. It didn't turn out to be an issue. They went on their first honeymoon to Spain, including Madrid and a long stay in a place called Benidorm, which is a seaside community in Valencia. And they wrote their honeymoon was basically getting some dumpy quarters near the beach, and you sit on one side of the room and write, and I sit on the other side of the room and write. That was and you know, I'm sure all kinds of sexual escapades as well. They had their first
Biting, some
biting
light
each
biting,
other,
maybe some heavy
right.
biting.
Yeah, yeah.
Mm,
Now,
mm.
interestingly enough, you can see that there are doubts and weirdnesses entering already, though, through Sylvia's writing. By the end of her honeymoon, this period in Valencia, she writes a short, she's almost completed a short story called The Wishing Box. And The Wishing Box is about a wife who commits suicide rather than endure another day in her magnificent husband's shadow,
Okay. I mean, come
right?
on. Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Okay. Some of the reputation, some of the cliche reputation
Yeah.
is
Yeah.
deserved.
Yeah. Yeah. I
Yeah.
agree.
Doesn't
I
come
agree.
from nowhere,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Just
I,
imagining like Susie and the Banshees is playing in the background. She's got just beer bottles and vodka bottles, and he's in it. And are they
mm.
drinking? Is he a drinker?
Not, they weren't like big drinkers. I mean, I
Hmm.
think, you know, they're in their 20s, so they probably were, but neither of them are like alcoholics. And I don't
Gotcha.
know that alcohol really contributed to their issues, I wouldn't say.
Right
Yeah.
on. They just had
Um,
just pure poet issues.
yeah, which is plenty. That's enough.
That's enough. Yeah,
Yeah.
talk to the poet. Check in
Yeah.
on the poets in your life,
Yeah.
people.
Yeah.
That's what I'm
Yeah.
going to say. Check
Yeah.
in. And I quite mean that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Not an
Um,
easy time, especially now, to be an American poet or to be
no.
a poet anywhere, I think.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. But this thing about her writing this story, The Wishing Box, it's an interesting it kicks off an interesting trend where they're both like, you could tell more about you could tell more about what's going on in their marriage through their writing, and not even necessarily what's happening, but like what their doubts and fears are through their writing. Like this one, but she's clearly afraid. It's like interpreting a dream, right? She's clearly afraid of being sort of overwhelmed by her husband's talent or career or whatever, right? That's what the story's about. And she writes like half a dozen of these. And not long later, Ted Hughes, he's writing plots for trying to sell plots to BBC for radio plays and productions. And like half of them are about like jealous, like marriage is being ripped apart by jealousy and adultery. You know, you're like, you've been married for like 9 months and all your stories are about adultery and jealousy. It's kind of like it's a little on the nose, isn't it? Um, so uh they also went then they got to the United States. So we talked about her time teaching at Smith. This is when she and Ted, after she graduated from Cambridge, they moved to the United States. She teaches at Smith, but first they go on a driving tour of the United States. They go up through Michigan into Wisconsin. They go into the Badlands and points west. They kind of struggled with the camping. This is kind of something that was interesting about Sylvia Plath, sort of like her inspiration from nature. Whenever she actually like, not, I shouldn't say whenever. It was like sometimes there's that nature is beautiful, and then like you actually have to deal with nature, and it's scary and hard. They encountered some of this in their road trip camping. In Yellowstone, they got the back window of their car torn out by a bear who was like going after their food. Um, that sort of thing. Uh, there's a great poem she wrote, another one of my favorites, called "Sleep in the Mojave Desert," that is inspired by this trip. And I'm gonna read just the first bit, the first stanza. Sleep in the Mojave Desert. Out here, there are no hearthstones, hot grains simply. It is dry, dry, and the air dangerous. Noonday acts queerly on the mind's eye, erecting a line of poplars in the middle distance, the only object beside the mad, straight road one can remember men and houses by. A cool wind should inhabit these leaves, and a dew collect on them, dearer than money, in the blue hour before sunup. Yet they recede, untouchable as tomorrow, or those glittery fictions of spilt water that glide ahead of the very thirsty. Now, when Sylvia met Ted Hughes, he was living in a tent, and by a year after them getting married, he would be like one of the most celebrated poets in England. And this is largely it's due to his writing, but it's due to her efforts. See, you got like a kind of bohemian countercultural, like proto-punk rock poet living in a tent. He may be a genius, but the only way that you can thrust that into like the quasi mainstream is if you have a type A striver like Sylvia Plath behind him, right? She begins to serve as his literary agent, and all the places she's sending stuff, she starts sending his stuff too, and it doesn't take long before his career starts to take off. That's largely her influence on him. His influence on her is a bit more magical and mercurial. Um, he's trying to pull her into a variety of sort of spooky ooky beliefs. Um, Ouija, he was always playing with a Ouija board. He was always trying to get her to get in on the Ouija board. Not, he was very into astrology. He's very into tarot. He's very into all of these sorts of things. Um, Sylvia Plath, despite all her sort of witchy reputation, wasn't as into that stuff as he was. But nonetheless, I'm going to read uh, a bit from her poem Ouija, like the Ouija board. Quote, "It is a chilly god, a god of shades, rises to the glass from his black fathoms. At the window, those unborn, those undone, assemble with the frail paleness of moths, an envious phosphorescence in their wings, vermilions, bronzes, colors of the sun, and the coal fire will not wholly console them. Imagine their deep hunger, deep as the dark for the blood heat that would ruddle or reclaim. The glass mouth sucks blood heat from my forefinger. The old god dribbles in return his words." Okay. So so Sylvia's, like I said, Sylvia kind of takes on Ted as a project. I mean, she believes that he's incredibly talented. She would call him a genius all the time. And I think though, not only did she want to help him, and that would help them as a family, right? If he's doing well, we're doing well, we're married. But I also think that she was strategizing. So poetry, like many things, used to be an old boys club. Maybe it still is. I don't know. I don't deal in the poetry world, but it was difficult for a woman to break into it. And I think kind of what she thought was like, okay, this guy is brilliant. If I figure out how to get him into the club, I'll just be able to like follow in right behind him, right? It's not a bad strategy, right? It's a way to hack the system, right? And he did have the goods to back it up. So I think that was kind of part of her plan too. I'm going to shove him in there and then I'll follow in right behind. And it kind of worked, to be honest. So if you're out there thinking about, if you're going to ride somebody's coattails, riding your spouse's coattails are probably the best. It's an all boats rise
They
kind
are
of thing.
technically your coattails as well
Exactly.
by law.
Exactly.
Half of those coattails are yours.
That's right. That's
You
right.
have a whole coattail.
Yeah. Yeah. Just hang on to that sucker. Yeah.
That's it. That's it.
Yeah. So how this looked was they got married in 1956. By mid 1957, he published his first collection, The Hawk and the Rain, which won immediate acclaim, prizes, and literally catapulted Ted Hughes into poetic stardom. It was a big deal poetry book when poetry could still move copies. They still talked about poets, and you might hear on the radio who the new big poet is, and you know what I mean. It's still poetry still participated in the mainstream sort of upper middle brow political context. Now, this thing of Sylvia kind of thrusting him forward I think she was okay with it at first, but eventually she wanted some of this too, and she started to feel jealousy, envy more so even than jealousy about his success, and was wanting people to kind of pay attention to her. Now, over time, it would fluctuate over the next few years who was getting the most publications and attention and money. But at first, it was Ted, and then he sort of dried up creatively for a while, and then it was her. So it definitely rose and fell over time, but he sort of went first, right? Um, Sylvia, in terms of writing, Sylvia never had a dry spell. She may have had a period that to her felt like she was a dry spell, but it was often very brief, and it was often usually followed up by a period of incredible productivity. So she never, and maybe if she would have lived another 30 years, maybe she would have had a dry spell, but in her young life, she never did. Um, let's see. Now, they had now one of the reasons that she wanted to get married with him, remember we were talking before about she wanted the family, she wanted the children, but she didn't want to get locked out of the life of the writer that she wanted to have. And with Ted, she believed, because he was Bohemian, she believed that she could have both in some way, right? And it did kind of work for a time. Um, Hughes, though, well, hold on a second. Let me read this thing. So, quote, this is from Red Comet. Quote, Hughes would later write, if Sylvia and I managed to get through it all, it was because for crucial years we defended each other. We were a sufficient world to each other. Our poetic folie à deux saved us from being isolated, surrounded, and eliminated. And their touchstone was the works of D.H. Lawrence. Quote, Lawrence sanctioned and sanctified the couple's passionate commitment to love, art, sex, nature. Plath, Hughes once said, was Laurentian rather than woman's lib. Yet Lady Chatterley's lover, like Wuthering Heights, was a strange marital touchstone. Plath could not have foreseen that Lawrence's, quote, belief in the blood upon which her marriage and her artistic partnership was built would also provide, for Hughes, the justification for its dissolution. So the marriage, they get married in 1956. Sylvia's dies in 1963. It's fairly, short, 7 years, not a hugely long time. Uh, Things begin to change when their daughter, significantly anyway, when their daughter Frida is born in April of 1960. Frida is named after the wife of D.H. Lawrence. This is the same year in which Sylvia would publish her book, The Colossus, which bears the marks of Hughes' influence, really. I mean, Hughes did help her find her voice, her poetic voice. But let's see. So after here's what Al Alvarez, who was a big time poetry critic and became a friend of Sylvia Plath and Ted Hughes. Here's what he's had to say about the Colossus. Quote, she steers clear of feminine charm, deliciousness, gentility, supersensitivity, and the act of being a poetess. She simply writes good poetry, and she does so with a seriousness that demands only that she be judged equally seriously. There is an admirable, no-nonsense air about this. The language is bare but vivid and precise, with a concentration that implies a good deal of disturbance with proportionately little fuss. The poet and translator Seamus Heaney said of the Colossus, quote, on every page, a poet is serving notice that she has earned her credentials and knows her trade. So let me see how long this poem is. Ooh, it's longer than I thought. Yeah, I'm gonna read a few stanzas of The Stones, which I believe it's in the Colossus, but now I'm second guessing myself. No, it's in the Colossus. The Stones. This is the city where men are mended. I lie on a great anvil. The flat blue sky circle flew off like the hat of a doll when I fell out of the light. I entered the stomach of indifference, the wordless cupboard. The mother of pestles diminished me. I became a still pebble. The stones of the belly were peaceable, the headstone quiet, jostled by nothing. Only the mouth hole piped out, importunate cricket in a quarry of silences. And it goes on for a while like that, but that's one of her poems. Okay, 1960. That book of poetry comes out. He has had The Hawk and the Rain and a number of other things. He has also started to appear on the BBC quite a bit, which makes him more of a sort of a household name, at least in England. But he's gotten quite a lot of attention in America. He's, by 1960, they've both been published in the New Yorker. They've both been published in the Atlantic. They've been published in all of the big names. They're at that
They're
time
a
you got paid.
poetic power couple.
They really are.
What are those two up to?
Yeah, exactly. And they're surviving by 1960 financially. They're actually doing all right. Like they're not rich, but they're doing fine. And what's interesting is Sylvia never forgets what it's like to scrape by. And so there's times she's literally like writing home with letters that like vaguely imply she's asking for money, but at the time they have like $70,000 in the bank in today's dollars, you know. But she's so in the mode of like scrimping and saving and pulling every little thing that she
It's
can't.
very hard to get over that if you've been living check to check.
Mhm.
People who know, most of us know
Yeah,
what that's like, and then you kind of never get over it. Even when you have money, you sort of go,
yeah,
"Ooh, it could all
right,
go. Is
right.
this any of this real?"
Right.
Mhm.
And especially when you're freelance like this, right? It's all about, well, what came in this month, right? And he gets a Guggenheim, which is a lot of money, and she gets some stuff too. But it's like, yeah, when you're freelance like that, you never know. It could literally all stop for you might not get another check for 3 months. You don't know what's going to happen. So, yeah. But nonetheless, there is definitely a big sort of stream of poetic publicity in 1960, and that's kind of where it probably reaches its height. Um, in 1958 or so, they had moved back to Europe after their time in the United States, and there they firmly established themselves in literary circles. They became, friends with Robert Lowell. That was kind of the United States, but they became friends with T.S. Eliot. T.S. Eliot, for all his curmudgeonly sort of hatred of everything, liked Ted Hughes. And if T.S. Eliot liked you as a poet, that was like, you had the golden ticket basically in that world. They were friends with also Robert Wilbur and Marion Moore and to a certain degree Rothko and Al Alvarez, who was the tastemaker poetic critic of his day, and in fact may have even dated and fooled around with Sylvia Plath for a brief period in that final few months of her life. Um, Plath would put together a critical quarterly anthology of American poetry that was quite popular. So it's none of her poems, it's other people's poems, but it sold 12,000 copies, which is a lot. And the editors acknowledged that in the early 60s, Plath helped introduce a whole new generation of university students to American poetry. So um, there's an influence on that from that, even if she never wrote a poem herself. Um, and then they had Frida in 1960, and then in 1961, we're kind of talking about how this marriage starts to turn sour. In 1961, there's a miscarriage. Um, I'm going to read a little bit from Red Comet here. With time, Plath had a different story to tell. On September 22nd, 1962, about 3 weeks before Hughes left her for good, and in the midst of a volatile separation, she would write to Dr. Barnhouse, quote, Ted beat me up physically a couple of days before my miscarriage. The baby I lost was due to be born on his birthday. I thought this an aberration and felt I had given him some cause. I had torn some of his papers in half so they could be taped together, not lost, in a fury that he had made me a couple of hours late to work at one of the several jobs I've had to eke out our income when things got tight. He was to mind Frida. But now I feel the role of father terrifies him. He tells me now it was weakness that made him unable to tell me he did not want children, and that his joyous planning with me of the names of our next two was out of cowardice as well. Well, bloody hell, I've got 20 years to take the responsibility of this cowardice. Sylvia had dated the miscarriage to Monday, February 6th, that's 1961, in her letter to Aurelia, but she suggested that it had been going on throughout the weekend of February 4th through the 5th. The fight then probably occurred during the first few days of February. There are no references to this disturbing incident in Sylvia's surviving journal entries of February and March 1961, which date to her time at the hospital and are extremely loving towards Ted. On the day she told Aurelia about the miscarriage, she called Ted the most blessed, kind person in the world, and noted how he was now taking wonderful care of her. Now, um, so she sort of implies that Ted beat her up and the miscarriage happened a couple days later. And so she sort of connects the two. Um, and Ted kind of said something in one of his journals that that may have been the case. But I think it's a little bit challenged by the fact that she went in for an appendectomy like a day or two after the miscarriage. And I don't know when your appendix is going bad, I don't know what all things or other things are going on in your body, but it seems to me that that could have contributed to it, a miscarriage as well. Like if you got an infected appendix, aren't there toxins? I don't know. I don't know. But the story is that Ted hit her right before this miscarriage, and so possibly the miscarriage contributed to the miscarriage. I I guess I can't say any more than that. If that's true, I mean, that's pretty screwed up. Um,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. Tough
yeah,
going. There have been movies and things about this too, right? Like
yeah,
their relationship and
yeah.
everything. Yeah.
There
Yeah.
have,
Sure.
yeah, yeah, um, yeah. So let's see. Now, after after the miscarriage, she's in the hospital for a while, and they kind of start to realize that actually they both seem to write better when the other one's not around. Like it started off as this like we're this twin flame thing, right? And we're kind of feeding off each other. And Ted would say that she was psychic, like, and that her psychic powers were overwhelming, and that he would also say that sometimes if they were writing in the same space, she would pluck an image right out of his head and it would end up in her poem. Um, who knows, right? Uh, but she spent some time in the hospital for this appendectomy, and her writing actually improved. She felt sort of lightened by not having sort of domestic duties of Frida for a little bit. Um, but the next big move they have, and this is where things really go off the rails in terms of their wet marriage, they move to Devon. Uh, and they got a big, I gotta find my page here. Um, they got a big like estate called Council Green or Court Green. Uh and it's about you can get to London on like a day by train, I think, but it's very much like an out of the way place. It's a little town. See if I can find this page. Here we go. um The Hughes arrived in the quiet country village of North Taunton, Devon on September 1st of 1961. Court Green was just a short walk from the town center with its small clock tower, post office, shops, and red brick town hall. Local footpaths offered stunning views of the surrounding moors. Their home was and still is one of the grandest in the village. But the space and the orchard and the garden, Ted exclaimed in a letter. The house conferred status on its new owners, whose grandparents had waited tables and cleaned houses. Sylvia joked to her friend Helga Hughes that she and Ted were the new lords of the manor. Sylvia immediately filled the house with flowers from the garden, great peachy colored gladiolas, hot red and orange and yellow zinnias. Frida loved tramping through the big rooms and got so much exercise that she needed 2 naps a day. Sylvia was thrilled to see her daughter so happy in the fresh country air. She felt calm and content. My whole spirit has expanded immensely. Um, let's see. On the next, where's the next bit? One more. Um, it's quote, ensconced in her own manor home with her cherished family, a book of poems and a novel to her name, though the novel wasn't done yet. Sylvia Plath finally had all that she wanted, and yet the first poem she wrote at Court Green depicted ruin rather than promise. The poem Wuthering Heights, named after the novel, is a portrait of the abandoned Yorkshire farmhouse, Top Withens, on which Emily Bronte allegedly based the novel. Sylvia and Ted had often hiked there over the moors in 1956 when they had blithely identified themselves with Cathy and Heathcliff. Plath's depiction of Top Withens in 1961, however, is a rueful backward glance. The poem set on Hughes's ground is filled with images of a home and perhaps a marriage coming apart. So they move to Devon. It's this whole idea of like we're gonna have this house out in the country and it's gonna be beautiful. And we're gonna have a garden. The children will play, and I'm gonna, keep bees and grow things and scrub the woodwood floors, and we'll have this very poetic life. Um, it very quickly doesn't, it very quickly turns dark out there. Um, I think they both sort of tricked themselves into thinking that's what they wanted. Like this whole idea of their relationship to nature was more wanting to look at it rather than being in it. They were really city people, the both of them. Uh, he missed it was he missed the city, he missed London, and she missed London, and they both told each other how happy they were to be out in the country, right? That it was sort of that situation.
It's a
And
long way from London. I mean, you're way out west there.
mhm,
Yeah,
yeah,
by Plymouth and all of that.
right. Yeah, it's out there. I mean, you can get there if you really need to, but I mean, it's a trip to get there. Um, there are there start to be some flirtations that Sylvia Plath catches. Like he starts flirting with like the 16-year-old neighbor girl. Not anything happened there, but he's flirting with her.
Yeah,
Uh,
yeah, yeah.
the I and
Yeah,
he'd
you're
had
probably bored.
yeah, and he'd
Yeah,
had wandering eyes before, but she hadn't really ever caught him in anything. Just that was any. She hadn't really caught him with anything, but had sort of seen him looking at women and stuff like that. Which whatever.
yeah.
Um, yeah, but at this point, it does. At some point, it does rise up to that next notch.
Oh boy,
Um,
my
yeah.
my Grubhub is here. I'm gonna grab it.
Okay, sure. Yeah. So, let me read this bit. Let's see. Oh, yeah. Yeah, bear with me here, folks. So, um, there's a sort of a how would I put this? There's a sort of a pattern that I hope that we've established. This sort of violent thing that the blood, the Laurentian blood thing. And there's a way in which, sure, that can be, I suppose, romantic. Uh, but I think when it comes to their lives, it ends up kind of taking this dark turn. I'm trying to find my page here. Let's see. So, yeah. Now, I think there's also a way of looking at, you know, I suppose in any relationship, there are both people bring good things and bring, less good things to a relationship. I think when we talk
You bring a
about
lot of fucking baggage. You bring a lot
yeah,
of garbage.
yeah,
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 yeah. Especially, I mean, and Sylvia clearly had
yeah,
problems.
yeah,
Yeah, and trauma. And I imagine
yeah.
he must have had his own
He,
business too. Yeah.
he had his own stuff. I mean, I think his own stuff was he didn't want to be he didn't want to be locked down. He didn't want to commit, though he did. He went with it. And she was sort of possessive, perhaps a little bit, and kind of intense, right? And would talk later about like, and she was also sexually intense, and she would talk later in letters and things about like, I'm not satisfied with this like twice a week facing each other American style of marriage. Like, and I need more than that. And she wasn't getting that from Ted either, because Ted was sort of losing interest in her, right? Because he's bored. But let me read this little
Wait,
passage.
she what is you telling me she's not into like twice a week missionary? Is that what you're telling me?
She needs more than that.
She needs more than that. Okay,
Yeah,
cool. All
yeah,
right.
yeah, yeah,
I'm on board.
yeah. Let me read this a little bit. Quote, Sylvia had written in her journal about scratches, sprained thumbs, and broken crockery after she had confronted Ted about his student in Northampton in 1958. She had also written about bruises after her first Holocaust night of sex with Ted. So the first night they had sex, she referred to it as a Holocaust, and she wanted it. That was her poetic turn of phrase, right?
Oh,
Yeah.
what? Well, I mean, and she would end up. I mean, this is not a joke at all, but she would
Mhm.
end up like in an oven, like gassing herself to death too. So
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
yikes,
Yeah. Yeah.
damn. I had no idea. I was not expecting this
Right.
like
Right.
intense sexual side.
Right. Right. Now, courting violence, as Plath's early drafts of Falcon Yard show, was something of an aesthetic stance and part of the couple's shared mythology. Indeed, the relationship began with violence on the night that they met, right? Sylvia and Sassoon's, a previous boyfriend, had experimented with rough sex, and according to one source, Gordon Lemire believed that his own relationship with Sylvia fizzled out because he refused to, quote, beat her up in the bedroom. Ted recalled that Sylvia once smashed his mahogany writing table made from his mother's heirloom sideboard with a stool in a fury when he was late to mind Frida. He told Francis McCullough later that this occurred on a different day from blah, 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 blah. Hughes saw in Plath's rage a deeper potential for her poems. He laughed when he witnessed the table's destruction. That's what you should have put into the Colossus, all that energy, he told her. She began to laugh and stopped. It was like a revelation to her. She did begin to do that. So you imagine there's like this tendency towards violence all the time, and she flips out. She starts breaking stuff, perhaps justifiably so. And he's like, that's what you need to be doing in your poetry. Like the dynamic here is intense, and it's sort of to my mind, there's a certain sense where it's sort of doomed because of that. It's like almost too much, if that makes sense. And then you're going to take all of that and you're going to try and we're just going to have a nice life out in the country.
Sure, we're going to go live in the country. Yeah, right.
Right.
Yeah,
it's not.
yeah, we're going to be in our 20s and yeah, crazy,
right. Yeah.
crazy.
Now, so here's where it all starts to go downhill, and then we're round the corner, we're around the horn here, Kevin. There's a woman named I don't know how to say her name. It's Assia, Asia. Anyway, I don't know. We're going to call her Assia Weevil. Was born in Berlin in 1927 to a Russian Jewish father and a German mother. She was married to the poet David Weevil, who is still alive. I think he teaches at University of Texas, Austin, actually. The Hugheses had rented out their London flat to this couple. So they bought this house in Devon and they still had their flat in London. They rented it out to these guys because there was a Cambridge poetry connection. And this sparked up a kind of friendship. Assia had read Ted's poetry, and when she came to know the Hugheses, she set her sights on him. She was going after him. By the summer of, actually, there's a bit I want to read here. This is actually important. Let me make sure I got it. Yeah, boy. All right. Sorry, folks, I'm navigating the ebook, and it's working out pretty well, but finding a specific page is
we're on the cutting edge of Art of Darkness technology. We're trying something new here, folks. I ate a couple of egg rolls.
Yeah, it's also trying something new.
I'm trying something new. We normally don't eat. We just had the baby. I'm just like, I gotta eat a couple of egg rolls. My sugar is, I need some insulin shock therapy.
Yeah.
I just had some insulin shock
right
therapy. I'm feeling fine. I just want to make sure everybody knows I'm fine. Just shove some egg rolls in my
They should have done that to Sylvia. They might have solved the problem.
Right. Yeah. Egg roll therapy. Why not?
We just stuff you full of egg rolls until you appreciate Chinese culture. I don't know.
How much do you weigh? You weigh 130 pounds. You're 5'6". 40 egg rolls. Just one after another until you achieve an egg roll coma.
Right. And until you accept your expected role in society.
Exactly. Until you submit to our authority.
Yeah. Right. Makes perfect sense. Quote, in London, Assia developed a reputation as both a tragic muse and a femme fatale. When she and David arrived in Hobsbawm's Stockwell flat for a group session, Peter Redgrove whispered to Hobsbawm, I know who she is. She has killed 2 men already and will be the death of David. That's her husband at the time. So Assia was married when she met Ted and Sylvia. Hobsbawm remembered her posh accent, her wit, and her skill with language. Together, she and David cut a slightly tragic, glamorous figure. The novelist Fay Weldon remembered that when they entered a room, heads turned. William Trevor thought Assia looked like Sophia Loren and David like Gary Cooper. They were beautiful and damned, he thought, like Scott Fitzgerald people, 60s style. Assia played the part especially well. She once tried to stab her second husband, Richard Lipsey, with a Burmese dagger near the entrance to the South Kensington tube station. So Ted and Sylvia are this poetic power couple, and Asya and David perhaps arguably are another one, perhaps arguably like lower on the power levels in terms of like poetic ability, who's to say. But again, we have this doubling thing. It's like two couples that are similar but different enough, and the way that they're different are like looking to a mirror, right? And when Assia meets Ted, she is like, I am going to seduce him. She sets out very deliberately to do it. Her being married and knowing Ted's married, she sets out to do this, apparently. Um, now, pretty soon, and they're friends, so they come out to the Devon house. Sylvia kind of catches them having a weird, intimate conversation in the kitchen, but it's not really enough to do anything. I mean, they're guests, of course, they could talk, right? So it's not clear what's going on. But very soon, it turns into phone calls to the house coming from London. It turns into all of a sudden Ted's got a bunch of more business in London than he used to, and he's out of town. He's leaving Sylvia behind with the kids. And one thing, and it kind of makes sense if you think about the arrangement of the marriage. One thing that pissed Sylvia off more than anything was when Ted expected her to just like pick up domestic duties. Um, and part of the problem was that this was the arrangement. It was like for a while, like he would write for 4 hours a day, and she would take care of the kids, and then he would write for 4 hours a day, and then vice versa, right? They would like try to equitably split it, but he would fall into sort of older style where like if he had something to do, well, he didn't ask. She had to take care of the kids, and she's trying to have her own career too. So that it's not just that he was stepping out, it's that he was like abandoning their arrangement for how they were going to run the house and all that, right? Now, um, Sylvia does catch on to this happening. Doesn't take that long, and Ted's not trying that hard to find it, right? All of a sudden, he's jumping up for the mail, and all of a sudden, he's answering the phone, which is all stuff that he used to leave her to do. Um, Sylvia would call, funnily enough, in letters, Sylvia would call Assia, this woman, Weevil, would call her asshole Weaver. That was her nickname for Assia. Um, yeah, let me read a little bit from the biography here. Um, and if you look up a picture of Assia Weevil, she is a very strikingly attractive woman. It's she's got a very, very intense look.
Yeah, if she's
Um,
German, it would probably be like Asia would be sort of
Asia.
how Asia.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Weevil. Yeah.
Okay. Vivo.
Yeah, very
Right. Right.
striking woman. Yeah,
Yeah.
indeed. Yeah.
hmm Now, one point, there's a phone call comes in. It's while Sylvia's mother happens to be visiting. A phone call comes in. uh, da, 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 da. Yeah, and Ted answers the phone. Quote, Ted said no, she couldn't see him over the phone, but I was standing there stunned. This is Sylvia saying this. Then the next day, after a night of no sleep and horrid talk, me asking him for God's sake to say who it was so it would stop being everybody, he took the train to London for a holiday. He assured me in a flash of his old self that me and the children were what he really loved and he would come back to, and he was not going to London to lie about and had not touched another woman since we were married. I have discontinued the phone for I can't stand waiting every minute to hear that girl breathing at the end of it, my voice at her fingertips, my life and happiness on her plate. Aurelia provided the only other eyewitness account. Sylvia went to the phone, put the receiver to her ear, and the few seconds silence led me to look over at her. Her face was ashen, and she called shrilly, Ted! He must have been just at the top of the stairs, probably expecting that call, for he fairly fell down in his haste to get to the phone. Sylvia dashed upstairs. From this moment on, the whole atmosphere within Court Green changed. Sylvia later pulled the phone cord out of the wall. The phone would not be in working order again until November. Ted's friend, the critic Keith Seger, thought, would you say Asia? Asia?
Asia. Asia.
Asia.
If it's German, yeah,
Yeah.
Asia. I mean, I think that's right. Yeah.
Yeah, thought Asia knew what she was doing. Telephone calls, he'd never pick up the telephone. It was, he thought, a ruthless tactic. This wasn't a way of contacting Ted. That was a way of destabilizing Sylvia. So some people thought she was deliberately trying to screw with Sylvia's head. It wasn't enough to have Ted Hughes. She had to like get into Sylvia's head, right? Yeah. And obviously Sylvia came to hate her a lot. And
Yeah,
yeah,
I don't have to be a woman to
yeah.
imagine, yeah, that kind of feeling.
The,
And
the,
she is striking. There's one picture where she looks like the woman, in Blade Runner.
yeah,
There's one
yeah,
picture, yeah, where you're like, oh, damn,
yeah, yeah.
yeah,
Yeah,
okay.
you could see if you're kind of bored in your life out in the country and this woman starts up and she's got her eyes on you. You can see how it happens.
Or bored in
Yeah.
the city, not
Yeah.
bored in the city, busy in the city,
Right.
busy in the country.
Right. Right. Um,
Man, maybe your cup overfloweth, Brad, but
yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
we're taken.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah, yeah,
Now, they basically separate after this comes about. Makes sense. Sylvia stays in the house of the children. He's off. Then she's off to some career-related thing, and he's at the house. So they're still in contact for the rest of Sylvia's life, and he's trying to sort of halfway do the dad thing. They end up going to an event where Hughes is getting some kind of accolade, and she'd already agreed to go. She really doesn't want to give him up, but same time, she cannot forgive him. And frankly, he's starting to feel liberated now. Like he's realizing, or he always knew, but he's accepted now that like he was feeling locked down in this marriage and the family and the two kids, and he wanted out. And maybe he was trying to get caught so he'd have a way out, right? Um, she starts sending out poems. Basically, all the poems she writes from here to the end of her life are about either Ted Hughes or about Asia. Uh, and yet they're not totally done with each other. She gets the flu, Sylvia does, and Ted comes to take care of her for a while out there in Devon. She gets the flu pretty hard, and the kids do too, and Ted comes out and takes care of her. Weirdly enough, they go on this trip to Ireland together in late 1962 to see Yates Tower and other things. And there does seem to be this sort of warmth growing between them. But then all of a sudden, on this trip, they've gone on this trip together. Hughes wakes up one morning and he says, "Honey, I gotta go fishing with my friend for a couple days while they're on vacation. And then I'll meet you when we catch the boat where we catch the boat in Dublin. How's that?" And then he just never shows up. So he's on vacation with Sylvia and he runs away to go to Spain and be with Asia. Um, and that betrayal was like almost worse. It was like we're
sure.
trying to get over this and you go do that. Like,
Yeah, right. You
that's
gotta dance with the one who brung you.
right, right,
Come on,
right.
Ted.
Yeah,
Come on, Ted Hughes.
pretty jacked up. Right. Now
Mm,
she begins to make legal moves towards a legal separation, possibly even a divorce. She's writing to Dr. Barnhouse in America. Dr. Barnhouse isn't really treating her. This is just sort of correspondence at this point. She's basically saying to Sylvia's like one thing: do not get back into bed with Ted. You got to figure out if you're going to separate or divorce or whatever. But like right now, don't sleep with the guy. Figure out what you're going to do. And weirdly enough, she never recommends to Sylvia to go see a therapist. And this has been criticized by people kind of looking back on this because Sylvia's desperate in these letters to her. Now, here's what Heather Clark says about what destroyed the marriage. Give me a second to get to this page here. And then I'll read you what Al Alvarez, who was actually close to the Plath and Hughes, what he says, and it's very, very interesting. So, am I on the right page? I must have got that wrong. Oh, here we go. Um, Quote, perhaps what finally doomed the marriage was neither Plath's possessiveness nor Hughes' adultery, but fame and its legendary temptations. There were other factors, obviously: depression, rivalry, disillusion, violence, class, to name but a few. But fame gave Hughes sexual and professional opportunities to expand at exactly the time Plath wanted him, as he saw it, to contract, to settle into a predictable domestic life. Plath had suggested as much when she told Dr. Barnhouse that movie stars had nothing on handsome male poets. And indeed, Hughes was now secure enough in his professional success to tell his sister with some bravado, quote, I'll gradually become the guiding taste at Faber's when Eliot retires. Fame made Hughes even more determined, as he told his sister in 1958, to sacrifice everything to his poetic vocation. He would, quote, pursue it at all costs, for it would be miserable. he wrote, to feel that your gifts have somehow fallen into pieces and come to nothing through neglect. This was the fate he was trying to avoid now with the walls of domesticity and fatherhood were closing in. Asya was his new muse, perhaps a directive from the goddess herself, and he felt he owed it to his gift to pursue her. Okay. Now here's what Al Alvarez, close friend of Sylvia and Ted, had to say. Quote, her sensibility was altogether different from her husband's, and on one level, saner, more urban, more intellectual, more governed by nerves than by instincts. In a word, more American. Belief in dark gods and shamans and the baleful influence of the stars didn't come naturally to her, but she had always been good at things, a fast learner and a high achiever, fiercely ambitious. Anything her husband could do, she could do better. So she went along willingly when they played spooky games with the Ouija board and read each other's horoscopes, or when Ted hypnotized her to help her with the birth of her first child. By the end, the pseudo black magic which Ted used cannily to get through to the sources of his inspiration had taken her over. When her husband left her for another woman, she took his manuscripts, mixed them with a debris of fingernail parings and dandruff from his desk, and burned them in a witch's ritual bonfire. As the flames died down, a single fragment paper drifted onto her foot. On it was the name of the woman he had left her for, Asya. Quote, her psychic gifts at almost any time, Ted wrote, were strong enough to make her frequently wish to be rid of them. With Sylvia's personal nightmares to contend with, Hugh's creative strategies would have worked on her like, say, the recovered memory games untrained rogue psychotherapists play on unwary patients, releasing the inner demons, then stepping aside with no thought of the consequences. Because he truly believed in her talent, he did it in the name of poetry. He handed her the key she had been looking for to find her dead father, and always the good student, she went down into the cellarage, key in hand. But the ghouls she released were malign. They helped her write great poems, but they destroyed her marriage. Then they destroyed her. Okay, so that's another take on it. Um, yeah, I do have one. Let me see if this how long this is. I did have one little bit from her I thought I might read. Um, yeah, this is the letter that she wrote, Sylvia wrote to Dr. Barnhouse, um, and around after that Ireland trip. Quote, I think I am dying. I am just desperate. Ted has deserted me. I've not seen him for 2 weeks. Tonight, utterly mad with his solitude, rain and wind hammering my 100 windows, I climbed to his study out of sheer homesickness to read his writing, lacking letters, and found them there. What was that? Found them there. Sheaves of passionate love poems to this one woman to whom he has been growing more and more faithful, describing their orgasms, her ivory body, her smell, her beauty, saying in a world of beauties he married a hag, talking about, quote, now I have hacked the octopus off at my ring finger. Many are fine poems. So, yeah. Um, okay. So, as we can imagine, and I guess hopefully have expressed, Sylvia does not take any of this well. And why should she? She's an intense woman. And there are a lot of things that she says and a lot of things that Ted purportedly says to her. Apparently, at one point, he says he tells her after he's been caught in this whole cheating thing. At one point, he tells her that he doesn't understand why she hasn't killed herself. And Sylvia thinks at one point that he wants her to kill herself, because then he'll be like free from this relationship, right? And I don't know if he said that or she said that, right? Like, this is where it gets tricky. It's like stuff people say to each other in their bedroom is not documented in history, right? Really. So it's like, who knows who's saying what to who. But there does seem to be, then this starts to break down. She writes some of her best poetry, which I guess is maybe perhaps not a surprise. That poem I read earlier, Ariel, comes about in this time, and a number of others. In December of 1962, she returns to London with the children, and she gets a 5-year lease, using up basically the very last of her money, on a flat that had been lived in once by William Butler Yeats.
It's a long lease, 5-year lease.
Yeah, I don't know what
I guess he could potentially break it at some point, but yeah. It's and she's like, I want the Yates flat. I want the Yates flat now.
No, and
Yeah.
it was like, I'll give up all my money. It felt like her, she was gonna be able to like perform some kind of poetic communion there, and it was worth all the money and whatever else. Um, Yates was one of her biggest influences. Now she rents this December of
Was
1962.
was
Go ahead.
this is this the one on Primrose Hill?
I
Is
believe
that
that's
where it
right.
is? Yeah.
I
Okay.
think that could
Okay.
be, yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. I'm just looking
Um,
up where it is.
sure, yeah,
It's near Camden,
okay,
Camden Town. So it'd be sort of be northish, but very central.
yeah, yeah.
All right.
Um, so she gets there in December 1962, and it's the coldest winter in supposedly 100 years. It's just her and the children. The pipes freeze. She gets what they call it, chilblains, where like your fingers swell up because
Yep.
you're
Yep.
so cold. She's trying to manage these two children. One's 2 years old, one's 9 months old, on her own, grief stricken, extremely depressed, trying to write poetry. Um, in December, the American publishers had rejected the Bell Jar, and though it did come out in English version under the name Victoria Lucas in January of 1963. So she's got this novel that comes out. Um, Writing wise, things actually were kind of going fairly well. Most things were getting accepted. Um, uh, and her novel got reviewed in the London Times in January of 1963. Uh, but again, it was under a different name, it was under Victoria Lucas, and at the time, nobody knew it was her. Um, but in the winter, the mood just gets darker and darker. She tries, reaching out to people for help. She doesn't necessarily know how to communicate what's going on for her. People didn't really know what to do. She wasn't sleeping. She was agitated. She started being haunted by suicidal thoughts once again. Ted was coming around to see the children, and it was probably good for the children, but I don't know if seeing Ted every couple of days was good for Sylvia, to be honest. I think for her, perhaps a clean break, but who knows? But like, she seemed like he came by and everything got stirred up again every time she saw him, right? Um, and and it's possible he was even making overtures about getting back together. It's not clear, even though he was still hanging out with Azia, and he was also in a relationship with this other woman who we will talk about. We're going to talk more about in the After Dark for patrons. We're going to talk more about Azia. We're going to talk more about another lover of Ted Hughes, and we're going to talk about something of a ghost story. So, yeah,
Patrons,
yeah,
get in. Get in. If
get
you're
in
not
there.
in already, get in there.
Yeah,
Come on. And then those of you who are already in, stay in. Get in,
yes,
stay in. Good stuff. There's going to be more
yeah.
stuff on the After Dark. Brad, you're
Mhm.
bringing it in. I could tell.
Yeah, we're coming
Yep.
towards the end here. Now,
Mm-hmm.
January 1963, a general practitioner named John Horder prescribed her an MAO inhibitor. Um, she had something like an allergic reaction to an MAO inhibitor in the 50s. Um, I don't know if she didn't know it was the same medication or the doctors didn't know or something, but this may have been the same medication she had this reaction to before. The doctor apparently tried to get her hospitalized, but she wouldn't go along with it. And when she wouldn't go along with it, he arranged for her to have a live-in nurse, at least for this early period as she was adjusting to the medication. Um, there's a lot of ins and outs and unanswered questions these last few days. And Carl Rollyson does a pretty darn good job of trying to nail it down, probably as good as anybody. Um, but some things we know for sure was going on. She feared being hospitalized again, right? She had PTSD from psychiatric treatment, which makes it very difficult for that person to have a sort of healthy relationship to psychiatric treatment. It was like the last time I had an episode, they electrocuted me. Am I really going to go to you know what I mean? Like you can kind of understand the reticence, right? Um, she was manic. She was having manic episodes. She wasn't sleeping. She was probably there's some suggestion she might have been starting to hallucinate. Um, uh, she was she started making plans for her suicide. She wrote a letter to her brother Warren that nobody has ever read, I don't think, that suggested that she may have been telling her brother, "I want you to take my children if something happens to me." Um, she was making very cryptic statements to friends that, in hindsight, after what happens, they all go, "Oh, that's what she was trying to say," right? She made like a lot of stuff like that. There are hours and even parts of days that are not accounted for here towards the end. Um, but what we do know is this. So we're very close to the end here. Um, let's see. So, quote, at about 7 a.m. on Monday, February 11th, 1963, Sylvia put bread, butter, and 2 baby bottles of milk in her children's room. She opened their windows, covered them with extra blankets, left the room, and taped around the outside edges of their door. Jillian remembered that Nick always awoke for the morning at 6 a.m. Sylvia had recently told Aurelia the same, which suggests that at least one child was awake while she acted. On a small, torn piece of paper in large black letters, she wrote her last note in separate angled lines. Please call Dr. Horder at PRI 3804. Her poems had flouted gentility, but she began her last written words with please. Across Regent's Park, the Beatles were getting ready to arrive at Abbey Road Studios at 10 a.m., where they would record their first album, Please Please Me. The morning of February 11th, 1963 was the dawn of the 60s. Sylvia Plath laid her last words against the stroller in the flat's entryway. In the kitchen, she stuffed the cracks around the door and window with tea towels and clothes and taped herself in. She turned down the gas taps, lay down on the floor, and placed her head on a folded cloth atop the oven's drop door. As she died, the sun rose out the large window to her left, flooding the kitchen with light. That was it. Yeah.
I'm not often left speechless on this pod because, of course,
Yeah.
we wouldn't have a pod
Right.
if I was. But that
Right.
is
It
heavy
is.
and dark. And
Mhm.
the children were home.
The children were home, and she took all these
Oh,
precautions basically so that the gas wouldn't enter their room. And what isn't cited there is I'm pretty sure she had somebody else that lived in the building, and she knew their schedule, and she timed it so that that guy would come home shortly after she did this. Basically so her kids wouldn't be unattended. It was like, okay, I know this guy's coming home. He'll see the thing, and you know, yeah. So,
what a way to go
mhm,
by
mhm.
gas.
That's
You just turn the gas on and you just lie down in the oven and fall asleep, I
yeah.
suppose.
You basically fall asleep. I think it's very similar to, when people do like carbon monoxide and start their car in their garage. I think things shut down very similarly to that. Yeah, yeah,
Oh,
yeah,
what a bummer.
yeah. Now the
30, 30.
30 years old, and she had, her book of poems, The Colossus, had come out, which I'd recommend to anybody. 1965, 2 years later, Ariel comes out, which I definitely recommend. Like that, I appreciate poetry. I'm not as well versed in poetry as I am in fiction and short stories and novels, but Ariel is a banger. It's like it's like a it- yeah, it's big and heavy and rocks. And so people should definitely check that out. The Bell Jar would be published under her name, I think in 1967. Um, and became a huge hit eventually. I think partially because suddenly her name was attached to it. And that's a good read. The Bell Jar, it's sort of uh it's the female, it's the woman's Catcher in the Rye. It's Catcher in the Rye for the 1950s women, whereas Catcher in the Rye was Catcher in the Rye for maybe for
For
19
the boys.
for the boys. Yeah. Yeah. And not in any derivative way.
Sure,
It's just it
sure. No,
fills that
no.
same
Yeah, yeah.
cultural space is
Right.
kind of my point. It has the same similar attitude.
Well,
Yeah.
she lived a lot in a short amount of time,
Hmm.
and the children lived, and the
Yep.
children who ended up looking after the children.
Yeah. So we're gonna talk about that more in the After Dark.
After
Yeah.
dark. All right,
Yeah.
let's cue it
Yeah.
up. We've gone. You did a fabulous job. Another
Thanks,
great core
man.
episode. The closing question. I'm just going to answer it real
Yeah.
abruptly. Should be
Yeah.
rewriting. She'd be writing
Yeah.
poetry. She'd be writing maybe another novel. Maybe we'd get another bit of autofiction if she had lived. I mean, that
Mhm.
closing question's always funny because it's sort of like, is she alive in her prime, in her 20s? What does she make of the world today? I just think
Right.
this is a writer. I mean, I think this is a
Mhm.
pure intellect and a pure writer. And from what poetry I heard you read and what I read, I don't see her doing really anything other than poetry
Yeah.
and following that white goddess
Yeah.
in her own way. But also, one wonders what she would make of the present in terms of advancements for women and all the rest. And I wonder if she would really think we've come that far, or maybe not. I don't know. We could talk
Yeah.
more about it on the After Dark, man.
That's a good point. Now let me read one let me close with this poem.
You got it.
This is the last poem she wrote, and it's no, we'll close on this. It's called Edge. The woman is perfected. Her dead body wears a smile of accomplishment. The illusion of a Greek necessity flows in the scrolls of her toga. Her bare feet seem to be saying, "We have come so far, it is over." Each dead child coiled a white serpent, one at each little pitcher of milk now empty. She has folded them back into her body as petals of a rose close when the garden stiffens and the odors bleed from the sweet, deep throats of the night flower. The moon has nothing to be sad about, staring from her hood of bone. She is used to this sort of thing. Her blacks crackle and drag. Okay.
See you on the After Dark.
Yeah, see you.